Daniel Matthews walked onto the stage of America's Greatest Talent, his white cane tapping softly against the polished floor, his eyes unseeing behind dark glasses, completely unaware that the man seated at the center judge's table, Richard Ashford, the most feared and cynical music producer in the country, was the same man who had told him 15 years ago that a blind boy would never make it as a pianist, that his disability would always be a limitation, not a gift. Richard didn't recognize the name on the roster, didn't remember the hopeful teenager he'd dismissed in 30 seconds at a community center audition. But as Daniel's fingers found the keys and the first notes pierced the silence, something inside Richard's carefully constructed walls began to crack. Daniel Matthews lived in a cramped one-bedroom apartment above Chen's laundromat on the eastern edge of the city, where the hum of industrial dryers and the sharp scent of detergent rose through the floorboards like clockwork every morning at 6. The apartment was small, the furniture second-hand and worn, the couch sagging in the middle from years of use by previous tenants he would never see. Bills accumulated on the kitchen counter in neat stacks, sorted by touch, by the texture of the paper, and the size of the envelopes, each one a reminder of how close he lived to the edge. He worked part-time as a piano tuner, a job that paid barely enough to cover rent and groceries, traveling by bus to the homes of people who had what he could only dream of: security, comfort, the grand pianos in rooms dedicated solely to music. His hands, calloused and careful, would adjust strings and hammers, listening to pitches with an ear so refined that clients often stood in doorways watching him work with something between admiration and pity. He knew that look even without seeing it. He had felt it his entire life, but none of that mattered when he came home to the piano that waited for him against the wall beneath the single window, an old upright his grandmother Clara had left him when she passed 3 years ago. The wood was scratched, the ivory keys yellowed and chipped, but it was his most precious possession, worth more than everything else in the apartment combined. Every night, long after the laundromat closed and the building settled into silence, Daniel would sit at that piano and play. His fingers would move across the keys with a fluidity that seemed impossible for someone who had never seen them, who had never seen anything at all. He had been blind since birth, his world constructed entirely of sounds and textures, temperatures and vibrations. Clara had raised him after his parents died in a car accident when he was only 2 years old, and she had recognized his gift early, had scraped together money for lessons, had sat beside him for hours as he practiced, her hand gentle on his shoulder, her voice unwavering in its belief. "You have something special, Daniel," she would say. "Don't let anyone tell you different." So he played for her memory now, for the woman who had given him everything, even when the world outside his apartment door remained indifferent to the music that poured from his soul. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. Daniel was 5 years old when Clara brought home the piano. It was a battered upright she had found at an estate sale, the varnish peeling, 2 keys stuck, but it was all she could afford on her grocery store cashier salary. She had saved for 8 months, skipping meals, mending clothes until they were more thread than fabric, all for this moment. She guided Daniel's small hand to the keys that first afternoon, his fingers tiny and uncertain against the cool ivory, and she pressed down on middle C, letting the note ring through their cramped kitchen. Daniel's face transformed. His head tilted, his unseeing eyes widening behind their clouded stillness, and his mouth opened in wonder as if he had just discovered light. He reached out on his own, pressing keys randomly at first, then with increasing intention, listening to how the sounds changed, how they could be high or low, harsh or gentle. Within an hour, he was picking out the melody to a lullaby Clara had sung to him every night since he was a baby. Within a week, he was playing it with both hands. Clara wept the first time she heard him, standing in the doorway with dish soap still on her hands, listening to this child who had been given so little by the world create something so achingly beautiful. The neighbors complained about the noise sometimes, but Clara never stopped him. She worked double shifts to pay for lessons with Mrs. Kowalski. an elderly piano teacher 3 blocks away, who agreed to teach Daniel for half her usual rate after hearing him play. Mrs. Kowalski would later tell Clara that she had taught for 47 years and had never encountered a student with Daniel's ear, his memory, his intuitive understanding of music theory. He could hear a piece once and play it back perfectly. Could identify any note or chord combination without hesitation. Could improvise variations that showed sophistication far beyond his years. Other teachers would visit, would test him, would shake their heads in amazement. But for Daniel and Clara, the piano was never about impressing anyone. It was their language, their shared joy, the thing that filled their small home with light even when the electricity was shut off for late payment. She would sit beside him for hours, her weathered hand on his thin shoulder, listening as he poured his young heart into melodies that seemed too wise, too profound. For a child who had never seen a sunrise but somehow understood beauty better than those who had. Daniel was 17 when Clara spent their entire savings to register him for the audition at Thornfield Academy of Music, one of the most prestigious conservatories in the country. She believed it was his chance, his doorway to the future he deserved, and she had pressed her best dress, had helped him into the suit they had bought at a thrift store, had ridden the bus with him across the city to the marble-floored building where dreams were either born or buried. The audition room was cold, the kind of cold that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the 3 judges seated behind a long table, their faces impassive, their pens poised over clipboards. Daniel had played Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor, his fingers finding every note with precision, his interpretation full of the raw emotion that made Clara weep whenever she heard it. But when the final chord faded, there was only silence. And then the voice of the man in the center, sharp and dismissive, cutting through Daniel's hope like a blade through paper. Richard Ashford, though Daniel did not know his name then, spoke with the casual cruelty of someone who had forgotten what it meant to be vulnerable. "This is very good for someone with your limitations," he had said, his tone making it clear that good was nowhere near good enough. But let's be realistic. Blindness might get you sympathy, might even get you on a local news segment, but it's a gimmick, not a foundation for a serious musical career. You'll always be the blind pianist. Not just the pianist. The Academy accepts students who can compete at the highest level, and frankly, your disability will always hold you back from that standard. I suggest you consider music therapy or teaching, something more appropriate. Daniel had sat frozen on the piano bench, his hands still resting on the keys, his throat tight, his chest hollow. Clara had found him afterward in the hallway, had wrapped her thin arms around him as his shoulders shook with silent sobs, as the words repeated in his mind like a curse. She had cupped his face in her hands, her voice fierce despite her own tears. "That man is wrong, Daniel. He doesn't see you. He doesn't hear you. One day, you're going to play, and the whole world will listen. And he'll know he was wrong. I promise you that." But the damage was done. The wound opened that day would take years to even begin to heal. Clara had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 3 years ago. The illness swift and merciless, stealing her strength week by week until the woman who had raised him with such fierce determination became small and fragile in a hospital bed that smelled of antiseptic and approaching death. Daniel had sat beside her every day, holding her hand, feeling the bones beneath papery skin, listening to her labored breathing replace the rhythm that had governed his entire life. She had made him promise not to stop playing, had whispered it through the morphine haze, her voice barely audible above the mechanical beeping of monitors. But Daniel had not touched a piano in the 2 months she was dying. He could not bear it. Music felt like a betrayal when she was suffering, felt like moving forward when he needed time to stop. She passed on a Tuesday morning in October, the light pale and cold through the hospital window. Her last breath so quiet that Daniel almost missed it, his hand still wrapped around hers, and his world tilting into a darkness even deeper than the one he had known since birth. The funeral was small. Afterward, he returned to the apartment alone, the silence so profound it felt like drowning. For 3 weeks, he did not go near the piano. He called in sick to his tuning jobs, ate only when hunger became pain, existed in a fog of grief, so thick he sometimes forgot to breathe. He thought seriously about selling the upright, about erasing the one thing that connected him to her, because the connection hurt too much to bear. But then, on a night when insomnia had him pacing the apartment at 3 in the morning, his hand brushed against the piano's edge as he passed, and something inside him broke open. He sat down, his fingers found the keys, and he played the lullaby she used to sing, the first song he had ever learned, and as the notes filled the empty apartment, he felt her there, not as a ghost, not as a fantasy, but as a presence woven into the music itself, into every chord and phrase, permanent and unshakable. He wept as he played, his body shaking, but he did not stop. When the song ended, he knew what he had to do. He would play. Not for fame or validation or proving anyone wrong, but for her, because she had believed in him when no one else did, and that belief deserved to be honored even if the world never listened. Daniel heard the advertisement on the radio one afternoon while tuning a piano in a client's home, the announcer's voice bright with manufactured enthusiasm, declaring that America's greatest talent was holding open auditions in the city, that anyone with a dream could sign up, that this was the year to take a chance. He had dismissed it immediately, had finished his work, and taken the bus home with the words already fading from his mind. He had learned long ago that talent shows were spectacles, not opportunities, that they fed on vulnerability and packaged human desperation as entertainment. But the advertisement played again that evening on his neighbor's television, the sound bleeding through the thin walls, and again the next morning on the kitchen radio, until it felt less like coincidence and more like the universe refusing to let him ignore it. He sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold, his fingers tracing the rim of the mug, and thought about all the auditions he had endured over the years, all the polite rejections, the patronizing smiles he could hear in people's voices, the weight of being seen as inspirational rather than talented. He thought about that judge 15 years ago, about the word gimmick, about how easy it would be to stay here in this apartment, safe and small and invisible. Mrs. Chen found him there an hour later when she knocked to return a mixing bowl she had borrowed. She was 83, had owned the laundromat below for 40 years, and had never once treated Daniel with anything but straightforward honesty. She listened as he explained the advertisement, his doubts, his fear of being hurt again. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, in her matter-of-fact way, "Your grandmother didn't raise a coward, Daniel. She raised a pianist. What are you so afraid of, that they'll say no? They've said no before. You're still here. You're still playing." Her words settled into him like stones into water. That night, he asked his computer's screen reader to help him navigate to the audition registration website, his hands hesitant on the keyboard. As he filled out the application, answering questions about his background and experience, he heard Clara's voice as clearly as if she were standing behind him, her hand on his shoulder, her words from a lifetime ago. "Be brave, Daniel. Be brave." He submitted the form before he could change his mind, and in the silence that followed, he felt something he had not felt in years. Hope. Richard Ashford lived on the 47th floor of a glass tower in the heart of the city. His penthouse apartment, a monument to success that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a skyline of lights he never really saw. Expensive furniture arranged in rooms he rarely used, the walls decorated with platinum records and industry awards that meant nothing to him anymore. He had built an empire in the music business, had discovered and destroyed careers with equal efficiency, had become the most sought-after and most feared judge in the industry. His name carried weight, his opinions shaped markets. But he came home every night to silence that no amount of money could fill. The music room was at the end of the hall, the door always closed, and inside sat Emma's piano. A Steinway Grand he had bought for her 13th birthday, its surface coated now with a fine layer of dust because he could not bring himself to touch it or to let anyone else near it. Emma had been 16 when the accident happened, 7 years ago on a rain-slicked highway. A drunk driver crossing the median, her life ending in an instant that Richard had spent every day since trying to understand. She had been a gifted pianist, truly gifted, with a future that should have included Juilliard and concert halls and everything Daniel Matthews would never have. Richard kept her room exactly as she had left it, her sheet music still open on the piano's stand, to Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. The last piece she had been learning, her backpack still hanging on the chair, her awards still lining the shelves. He would stand in the doorway, sometimes late at night, a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring at the piano as if his grief alone could bring her back to play it. The judging gig on America's Greatest Talent had been his agent's idea. A way to keep him relevant, to keep him working. But Richard used it as something else entirely. He used it as armor. Every harsh critique, every dismissive comment, every contestant he reduced to tears was a way of not feeling the thing that would destroy him if he let it surface. He had become cruel because cruelty was simpler than grief. Because if he stayed angry at the world, at mediocrity, at people who wasted the chances his daughter never got, then he did not have to face the truth that he had failed to protect the one person who mattered. Richard arrived at the studio each morning at 7. His coffee black and bitter, his expression already set in the permanent scowl that contestants had come to dread. He sat at the center of the judges' table like a king on a throne, flanked by 2 other judges whose names and opinions he barely registered, and he wielded his critique like a weapon designed for maximum damage. Over the past 3 seasons, he had made grown men cry, had reduced aspiring singers to trembling silence, had told a 17-year-old girl that she should consider a career in anything but music because her mediocrity was an insult to everyone who had worked to get where she was. The internet called him heartless. The producers loved him. The ratings soared. Richard told himself he was doing them a favor. That the music industry was brutal and unforgiving. That he was simply preparing them for the rejection they would face anyway. Better to hear the truth from him now than waste years chasing a dream they would never catch. Better to be cruel than to let them suffer false hope. He did not see the contradiction in his logic, did not recognize that he was punishing strangers for a loss that had nothing to do with them. The night before auditions, his assistant Jennifer brought him a stack of contestant files, brief summaries of the people who would perform the next day. Richard flipped through them with barely concealed boredom, his eyes skimming names and backgrounds without retaining any of it. A pop singer from Nebraska, a country duo from Texas, a magician who apparently also sang. Jennifer leaned over his shoulder and pointed to one file near the middle of the stack. "This one might be interesting," she said. "Daniel Matthews, blind pianist, been playing since he was 5, works as a piano tuner." Richard glanced at the name for less than 2 seconds before moving to the next file. He had seen dozens of disability angle contestants over the years, had learned to view them with the same skepticism he viewed everyone else. The name Daniel Matthews meant nothing to him. He did not remember a teenager at a community center audition 15 years ago, did not remember the words he had spoken, did not remember the hope he had crushed. That boy, if Richard had thought of him at all, would have been just one of hundreds of failed auditions in a career built on separating the worthy from the delusional. Daniel took the bus to the audition venue on a Saturday morning in late March. His white cane folded in his lap, his hands gripping the seat in front of him as the vehicle lurched through traffic. His stomach churned with nerves that felt different from the usual anxiety of public performance, heavier somehow, weighted with the sense that something significant was about to happen. Though he could not say what, the venue was a converted theater downtown. And when Daniel stepped off the bus, the noise hit him like a physical force. Hundreds of voices overlapping, footsteps echoing off concrete, car horns blaring from the street, all of it amplified by his heightened senses until he had to pause on the sidewalk to orient himself to separate signal from chaos. A young woman's voice cut through the din, gentle and close. "Hi there, I'm Sarah. Are you here for the auditions? Let me help you inside." She took his arm with practiced ease, neither hovering nor pulling, and guided him through the crowd and into the building where the air conditioning carried the scent of industrial carpet and stale popcorn and the hairspray and perfume of nervous performers. Backstage was a maze of hallways and waiting areas, and Sarah stayed with him, explaining the layout, showing him where the bathroom was, where the water fountain stood, leading him finally to a large holding room filled with other contestants. The energy in the room was electric and anxious, a mixture of excitement and terror that Daniel could taste on his tongue. He found a chair against the wall and sat, his cane between his knees, trying to steady his breathing. A voice beside him said, "First time?" Daniel turned toward the sound and nodded. The voice belonged to Tom, a 24-year-old singer from Ohio with dreams bigger than his talent, though Daniel would not learn that until later. They talked in the easy way of strangers united by shared fear. And Tom asked about Daniel's story, about how long he had been playing, about what made him decide to audition. Daniel answered honestly, leaving out the parts that hurt too much to share with someone he had just met. And Tom listened with genuine interest, occasionally reaching over to squeeze Daniel's shoulder in encouragement. Around them, other contestants practiced scales, ran through routines, paced nervously, and Daniel sat still, his hands resting on his knees, his mind focused on the moment ahead. The waiting stretched for hours, each minute feeling longer than the last, and Daniel's anxiety built like pressure behind a dam until his entire body felt tight with it. His fingers moved unconsciously against his thighs, playing invisible keys, running through the piece he had chosen to perform, muscle memory trying to soothe nerves that would not be soothed. Tom sat beside him, quieter now, and eventually confessed that he was terrified, that he had driven 12 hours to get here and was starting to think it was a mistake, that he was not good enough for this, that the judges would tear him apart. Daniel understood that fear intimately, had lived with it for so long it felt like a permanent resident in his chest, and he told Tom the only thing that had ever helped him. "You came this far. That means something. Just do your best and let the rest go." Tom laughed, a sound without much humor, and said, "Easy for you to say. You're actually talented." The other judges arrived throughout the afternoon, their presence announced by the sudden increase in staff activity, by whispered conversations, and the click of expensive shoes on linoleum. Daniel heard fragments of names he did not recognize, felt the energy in the room shift each time someone important passed through, but none of it registered as significant until two production assistants walked past his chair, their voices low, but not low enough. "Richard Ashford is in a particularly bad mood today," one of them said, "worse than usual. Tore apart 3 contestants already in rehearsal." The other assistant groaned. "Great. It's going to be a bloodbath." They moved on, but the name lingered in Daniel's mind like a splinter, sharp and uncomfortable. Richard Ashford. He knew that name. He was certain he knew it from somewhere beyond the show, beyond the celebrity judge persona. But the memory would not surface, would not take shape, hovered just out of reach like something glimpsed in peripheral vision. His fingers stopped their invisible playing. His breath caught for reasons he could not explain. Tom noticed the change and asked if he was okay, and Daniel nodded, forcing a smile, pushing the discomfort aside. It was just a name, just nerves making connections that were not there. But somewhere deep in his mind, in the place where trauma lives, even when conscious memory has tried to bury it, something recognized the danger before he did. A production assistant called his name, and everything inside Daniel went still. He stood, his legs unsteady, his white cane unfolding with a practiced flick of his wrist. And Tom squeezed his arm once, hard, before letting go. Sarah appeared to guide him through the wings, her voice soft and reassuring as she described the path ahead. But Daniel barely heard her over the sound of his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Then he was walking onto the stage, his cane tapping against polished wood, each step measured and careful. And the silence that greeted him was massive, the kind of silence that could only come from hundreds of people holding their breath at once. He could feel their eyes on him, could sense the weight of their attention, their curiosity, their pity, and he forced himself to keep moving forward, to not let the enormity of the moment overwhelm him. At the judges' table, Richard Ashford sat in his usual position, his posture slouched, his expression one of practiced boredom. He glanced down at his notes without really reading them, already preparing his critique in his mind, already dismissing this contestant before a single note had been played. He had seen this type before, the inspirational disability story, and while he might be cruel, He was not foolish enough to be overtly harsh on camera to someone blind. He would be measured, diplomatic, ultimately discouraging. The other two judges, a former pop star and a Broadway producer, watched Daniel with expressions that mixed sympathy with genuine curiosity, wondering what this quiet man with his white cane and worn suit would offer them. Daniel reached the piano, a beautiful grand that reflected stage lights like water, and his hands reached out, finding the edges, the cool smoothness of lacquered wood, then moving to the keys. His fingers touched them lightly, orienting himself, finding middle C, feeling the familiar spacing, the resistance of the hammers beneath. This was his language. This was home. The anxiety did not disappear entirely, but it transformed into something else, into focus, into purpose. He settled onto the bench, adjusted his position slightly. And in the breath before he began, he thought of Clara, of her hand on his shoulder, of her voice telling him to be brave, and he let that memory fill him with something stronger than fear. Daniel's fingers touched the keys, and the first notes emerged, delicate and haunting, a melody so simple it seemed almost fragile, yet it carried within it a weight that filled the entire theater. He had written this piece 3 years ago, in the weeks after Clara's funeral, had titled it Nothing because it needed no name, because it was simply everything he had felt in those dark months distilled into sound. The opening was soft, almost hesitant, like a question posed to the universe, and it floated through the silence with a purity that made the audience lean forward unconsciously, made them forget to breathe. Richard's head snapped up from his notes, his pen stilling mid-air. Something in those first few bars catching him with unexpected force. It was not the technical skill, though that was immediately apparent, nor the confident touch of someone who knew the instrument intimately. It was something else, something in the emotional architecture of the melody itself, a quality he had not heard in years, a nakedness in the music that felt almost too intimate to witness. The piece began to build, Daniel's left hand adding a bass line that grounded the melody, his right hand weaving variations that spoke of loss and longing, of love that persisted even in absence. His face, which had been tense with nerves moments before, softened into an expression of profound peace. His unseeing eyes closed behind his dark glasses, his body swaying slightly with the rhythm, and it became clear to everyone watching that he was not performing for them at all. He was somewhere else entirely, somewhere private and sacred, and they were merely privileged witnesses to a conversation between his soul and the instrument. Every emotion he had ever felt poured through his fingers, the grief of losing Clara, the joy of her love, the years of rejection and perseverance, the loneliness of his small apartment, the hope that had brought him here despite everything. It was all there in the music, honest and unfiltered, and the audience sat transfixed, some with tears already forming, feeling something they could not name but recognized instantly as truth. Richard's hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white, and a memory he had buried long ago began to stir. The music swelled, Daniel's hands moving across the keyboard with increasing intensity, the melody transforming from gentle questioning into something more insistent, more urgent, as if the piece itself was demanding to be heard. His fingers flew through passages of startling technical complexity, arpeggios cascading like water, chord progressions that shifted and evolved with a sophistication that betrayed years of dedication and study, all executed without a single glance at the keys because he had never needed to see them, had learned the geography of the piano the way others learned the features of a lover's face. His expression showed everything, pain etched into the furrow of his brow, joy flickering at the corners of his mouth, loss hollowing his cheeks, connection radiating from every movement of his body as he leaned into the instrument, as his shoulders rose and fell with the dynamics, as his head tilted back during the crescendos, as if he were listening to something beyond the physical sound. Something only he could hear. Richard felt his carefully constructed armor beginning to crack, felt fissures spreading through the walls he had spent 7 years building. And with the cracks came memory, sharp and unwelcome. Emma at her piano, playing with this same total immersion, this same vulnerability, her face showing the same peace Daniel showed now. She had played like this, as if the music was not something separate from herself but an extension of her very being. And watching Daniel, hearing this composition that seemed to reach inside Richard's chest and squeeze, he was suddenly back in his music room at home, standing in the doorway, watching his daughter practice, feeling the pride and love that had defined him before grief had replaced everything. The other two judges sat motionless, tears streaming openly down the pop star's face, the Broadway producer's hand pressed against his mouth as if to hold back a sob. Around the theater, audience members wept, strangers reaching for each other's hands, united in the shared experience of witnessing something rare and true. And still Daniel played, building towards something, the piece not yet complete, the emotional journey not yet resolved. His fingers never faltering, his technique flawless, proof that blindness was not a limitation but simply a different way of seeing, of understanding, of creating beauty that transcended the physical world. The music reached its peak, a moment of such intensity that it felt as though the entire theater might shatter from the force of it. Daniel's hands striking chords that rang out like declarations, like demands for the world to acknowledge what had been lost and what remained. Then, as if a dam had broken and released not destruction but grace, the piece softened, the fury dissolving into something achingly tender, a melody so gentle and heartbreaking that it felt like a hand reaching across the divide between the living and the dead. This was the resolution, the answer to the question the opening had posed. And the answer was both acceptance and eternal love. Grief transformed not into absence, but into presence that would never fade. Richard felt the first tear fall before he realized he was crying. Hot against his cheek, his hands trembling on the table in front of him, his breath coming in shallow gasps as 7 years of suppressed agony broke through the walls he had built. Emma flooded back with overwhelming force, not as the abstract memory he allowed himself in controlled doses, but as the living, breathing girl she had been. Her laugh, her stubborn determination, the way she would get lost in music exactly as Daniel was lost now. The future she should have had, the hole in the world where she was supposed to be. He had not allowed himself to feel this, had not permitted the full weight of his grief, because he knew it would destroy him. But Daniel's music had bypassed every defense, had reached directly into the wound and opened it completely. And Richard could not stop the tears, could not control the shaking, could not do anything but surrender to the tidal wave of emotion that threatened to drown him. Daniel played the final phrase, his touch feather-light on the keys, each note placed with infinite care, the melody resolving into a simple progression that sounded like, "Goodbye, and I love you and thank you all at once." The last note hung in the air like a prayer, sustained by the pedal, fading slowly, slowly, until the silence that followed it felt sacred, felt like the moment after a confession, when forgiveness hangs in the balance. Daniel's hands lifted from the keys and came to rest in his lap, and he sat perfectly still, his face peaceful, having given everything he had. The silence that followed stretched for 3 heartbeats, 4, 5, and Daniel remained seated at the piano, unsure, vulnerable, waiting for a response he could not see. Then the applause erupted like thunder, sudden and overwhelming, the entire audience rising to their feet as one, their clapping building into a roar that shook the walls, that filled every corner of the theater, with sound that was part celebration and part catharsis. Daniel stood slowly, his movements careful, his face showing not triumph but a quiet dignity, an acknowledgement that he had done what he came to do regardless of the outcome. The 2 judges beside Richard were on their feet immediately, applauding with tears still streaming, shouting words of praise that were lost in the noise. But Richard remained in his chair, unable to stand, his head buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking with the force of his weeping, and the cameras captured it all. This moment of the cruelest judge in television breaking completely, his defenses shattered by a blind pianist he did not yet know he had destroyed 15 years ago. The host, a polished woman named Amanda, walked onto the stage as the applause finally began to subside, her own eyes red-rimmed, and she approached Daniel with genuine warmth, placing a hand on his arm to let him know she was there. "That was extraordinary," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Tell us about yourself, Daniel. Who taught you to play like that?" Daniel's voice was quiet but steady, carrying clearly through the microphone clipped to his collar. "My grandmother Clara raised me. She gave me my first piano when I was 5. She believed in me when no one else did." He paused and then continued, his words simple and honest. "I've been told my whole life that I'd never succeed, that being blind was a limitation I couldn't overcome. Maybe that's true. Maybe I'll never have the career other pianists have. But I don't play for success. I play because my grandmother taught me that music is love made audible, and as long as I can do that, I've already won." The audience erupted again, and Amanda wiped her eyes, and Richard's hands trembled against his face. Amanda turned to the judges' table, inviting their feedback, and the pop star spoke first, her voice choked with emotion, saying something about transcendence and raw talent, and a standing ovation being insufficient. The Broadway producer echoed the sentiment, adding that in 30 years of watching performers, he had rarely witnessed anything so moving. Then all eyes turned to Richard, and the audience held its collective breath, because even those who had never watched the show knew his reputation, knew that this was the man who destroyed dreams for sport. Richard sat motionless for a long moment, his hands still covering his face, and the other judges exchanged glances of concern, uncertain whether to intervene. Finally, with visible effort, Richard lowered his hands and stood. His legs unsteady, his face wet with tears he made no attempt to hide. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound emerged, and he had to pause, had to swallow hard and try again. "Daniel," he said, his voice breaking on the name, splintering into fragments of sound that barely held together. "I need to tell you something. Your playing just reminded me of someone I lost, someone very important to me." He stopped, breathing hard, fighting for control he could not quite achieve. His hands gripped the edge of the table as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. "I have spent my entire career on this show judging people before they even open their mouths, before they play a single note, and I was doing the same to you. I saw your cane and I made assumptions. I was wrong. You are not just talented, you are a genuine artist. What you just did was not a performance. It was truth." The camera zoomed in on his face, capturing every tear, every crack in the facade, and millions of viewers would later say they had never seen him look so human, so broken, so real. Richard's voice steadied slightly as he delivered his verdict. "It's a yes from me. It's the easiest yes I've ever given. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for ever doubting you." The applause thundered again, but Daniel stood very still on stage, his brow furrowed, something in Richard's voice triggering that same uncomfortable recognition he had felt backstage, that splinter of memory that would not quite surface. After the cameras stopped rolling and the audience filed out, and the other contestants crowded around, Daniel with congratulations he barely registered. Richard approached Amanda and asked, quietly, if he could speak with Daniel privately. She looked at him with surprise, with concern at his still raw emotional state. But she nodded and found Sarah, who found Daniel and explained that one of the judges wanted to talk. Daniel agreed, though something in his chest tightened with apprehension. And Sarah led him through the backstage maze to a small production room that smelled of coffee and electrical equipment. Richard was already there, pacing, and when the door closed and they were alone, the silence felt heavy with unspoken things. Daniel stood near the door, his cane in one hand, waiting. Richard's voice, when he finally spoke, was still rough from crying. "Daniel, I need to ask you something. Have you auditioned for music schools before? Conservatories?" Daniel nodded slowly. "A few times," he said. "When I was younger." Richard moved closer, his footsteps careful. "Do you remember any of the judges? Any of them specifically?" The question hung in the air, and Daniel felt that splinter of memory suddenly sharpen into focus, pieces connecting that he had kept separate for 15 years. "There was one," he said quietly, "at Thornfield Academy. I was 17. The judge told me that blindness was a gimmick, that I'd never compete at the highest level, that I should consider music therapy instead of performance." Richard's face went pale. the color draining so completely he thought he might be sick. "When was this?" 15 years ago, Daniel said, and his voice was steady, but something in it had changed, had hardened. "It was a community center audition. There were 3 judges, but only one spoke. He said my disability would always hold me back." Richard's legs nearly gave out, and he reached for the wall to steady himself. "That was me," he whispered. "Oh God, Daniel, that was me." The room seemed to tilt, reality rearranging itself around this terrible recognition. "I didn't remember your name. I didn't remember you. But that was me." Richard's confession poured out in broken fragments, words tumbling over each other as 15 years of accumulated shame found voice. "I was cruel," he said, his hands shaking. "I was cruel before I had any real reason to be. I had built my career on being the tough judge, on separating the talented from the delusional, and I had convinced myself that harshness was honesty. I didn't see you that day. I saw a disability, an angle, something I could dismiss in 30 seconds, so I could move on to the next audition. I was wrong. I was so catastrophically wrong." He paused, breathing hard. And when he continued, his voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I had a daughter named Emma. She was a pianist, gifted, truly gifted, with the same passion you have, the same purity in her playing. She was 16 when she died. Car accident." He could not continue for a moment. The grief still too fresh despite the passage of time. "I was hard before I lost her, but afterward I became something worse. I used cruelty as armor because if I stayed angry, if I kept judging everyone as unworthy, I didn't have to feel what was really there. When you played today, Daniel, it broke through everything. Your music had the same quality Emma's did, that emotional honesty that can't be taught or faked. It reminded me what music is supposed to be, what I've spent years trying not to feel." Daniel stood very still, processing this revelation, his face unreadable. He had carried the wound of that audition for 15 years, had built his identity partly around overcoming those words, and now to learn that the man who spoke them was himself destroyed by loss, that the cruelty came from pain rather than malice, created a complexity he was not prepared to navigate. The anger he expected to feel would not come. Instead, there was only a deep, aching sadness for both of them, for all the years wasted, for all the ways that grief and fear had shaped their paths. "I'm sorry," Richard said again, his voice breaking. "I'm so deeply sorry. I can't take back what I did to you. I can't undo that damage. But I need you to know that I was wrong and that your grandmother was right about you." Daniel was quiet for a long time, and Richard waited in agony for the anger he deserved, for the condemnation he had earned. But when Daniel finally spoke, his voice carried something Richard had not expected. "Grace, you're right that what you said hurt me," Daniel said slowly. "It hurt for years. I carried those words with me like stones in my pockets, weighing me down every time I tried to move forward. But I need you to understand something. That rejection, as painful as it was, it clarified things for me. It forced me to ask myself why I was playing, who I was playing for. If I had gotten into that academy, maybe I would have spent my life chasing validation from people like you, from judges and critics and audiences. Instead, I learned to play for my grandmother, for myself, for the music itself. In a strange way, you gave me a gift, even if you didn't mean to." Richard's face crumpled. But Daniel continued, his unseeing eyes directed toward where Richard stood, his expression open and honest. "I can see your pain," he said, and the words carried no irony despite the blindness, because seeing had nothing to do with eyes. "I heard it in your voice during the audition. I hear it now. You've been punishing yourself and everyone around you for 7 years, and I think you believe you deserve it. Maybe you think being cruel is penance. But your daughter wouldn't want that. I never met her, but if she played with the kind of love you described, she wouldn't want you to live this way." Richard sank into a chair, his body folding in on itself, and for the first time since Emma's death, he allowed himself to truly weep in front of another person. Not the careful, controlled tears of private grief, but the raw, gasping sobs of someone finally releasing what they had held too long. Daniel moved closer, his cane tapping softly, and when he reached Richard, he placed a hand on the older man's shoulder, a gesture of comfort from the person who should have been comforting no one. They stayed like that for several minutes, two men who had been on opposite sides of cruelty and compassion, united now by shared understanding of loss and the redemptive power of honesty. When Richard finally composed himself, he looked up at Daniel with an expression that had shed all pretense, all armor, and what remained was simply human. "I want to help you," he said, not as an apology, not as penance, but because I genuinely believe in what you do. I have connections throughout the music industry. I can open doors that have been closed to you. I can make sure people hear you, really hear you, the way I should have 15 years ago. Daniel tilted his head, considering, and when he responded, his voice was measured but not cold. "I don't want charity, Richard. I don't want you to help me because you feel guilty. If we're going to do this, it has to be because you believe in the music, not because you're trying to fix the past." "I believe in the music," Richard said immediately, with a certainty that surprised them both. "What you played today was the most honest thing I've heard in years. The world needs to hear it." They sat in silence for a moment, and then Richard spoke again, his voice tentative. "Every year on Emma's birthday, I host a memorial concert. Small, intimate, just musicians who knew her or who remind me of her spirit. It's in 2 months." Daniel's breath caught, understanding the weight of what was being offered, the trust implicit in the invitation. "I'd be honored," he said simply. Richard nodded, something in his chest loosening, grief beginning its slow transformation into hope, into purpose beyond self-punishment. Outside in the hallway, Sarah had been waiting to escort Daniel back to the main area, and through the small window in the door, she had watched the conversation unfold, had seen Richard's breakdown, and Daniel's unexpected compassion, had witnessed two broken men finding an unlikely connection. She smiled, thinking about how the universe sometimes worked in ways that defied logic, how the cruelest judge and the humble pianist had needed each other in ways neither could have predicted. When the door finally opened and Daniel emerged, his expression peaceful, Sarah took his arm and whispered, "That was something special in there, wasn't it?" Daniel smiled, a real smile that reached his unseeing eyes. "Yes," he said. "I think it was." 6 months later, Daniel Matthews stood on the stage of Carnegie Hall, the most prestigious concert venue in the world, his hands resting on a Steinway grand that reflected the lights of 3,000 people who had come to hear him play. Richard Ashford sat in the front row, his face transformed from the cynical mask he had worn for so many years into something open and alive with hope. The concert was a benefit for the Emma Ashford Foundation, an organization Richard had established to support disabled musicians, to provide instruments and training and opportunities to those who had been told, as Daniel had been told, that their limitations would define them. Clara's old upright piano, the instrument that had carried Daniel through his darkest years, had been restored and donated to the Riverside School for Blind Children, where it now brought joy to students who were just discovering their own gifts. Daniel began to play, the same composition he had performed at the audition, and as the notes filled the hall, Richard felt tears on his face again. But they were different now, not the tears of suppressed grief finally breaking free, but the tears of gratitude, of witnessing beauty, of understanding that Emma's legacy lived on, not in his cruelty, but in the kindness he was learning to extend. The audience listened in reverent silence, and when the final note faded, the applause was thunderous, sustained, a celebration not just of talent but of perseverance, of the triumph of authentic artistry over cynicism and doubt. Because this is what we must remember, that one act of courage, one moment of vulnerability, one person refusing to let the world diminish their light, can create ripples that transform not just their own life, but the lives of everyone they touch. Daniel's kindness in the face of Richard's cruelty had broken through walls that seemed impenetrable. His perseverance, despite years of rejection, had proven that success is not measured by others' definitions, but by the authentic expression of our truest selves. And Richard's willingness to face his pain, to admit his failures, to accept the grace Daniel offered, showed that it is never too late for redemption, never too late to become the person we were meant to be. Second chances are not just given. They are created through the brave choice to be honest, to be vulnerable, to believe that love and art and human connection matter more than the armor we build to protect ourselves from feeling.